Hello and welcome. My name is Danielle Mages-Amato. I'm the literary manager and dramaturg of the Old Globe here in San Diego. And I'm so glad you've all joined us again for this session of On Book. I know many of you have been with us through our conversation of The Taming of the Shrew, but if anyone's just joining us to begin a conversation of Henry V, welcome, welcome. We're very glad to have you here. One of the things we wanted to do as we're kicking off this new conversation of a new play and an entirely new genre is to talk a little bit about what is a history play. So what I've done is invited back a guest we've had on the in the group before, Professor Abraham Stoll. So let me see if I can get Professor Stoll on here. Hello.
Hi, Danielle.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. I introduced Professor Stoll last time, but I will give a brief introduction again. Professor Stoll is specializes in Renaissance and early modern literature. He has his PhD from Princeton University, and he's on the faculty of the University of San Diego in their English department. And he also teaches in the Old Globe USD Shiley graduate program, where he teaches Shakespeare and serves as a dramaturg on their productions. So welcome back.
Thank you so much.
I want to confess to you as we start this conversation that for my own history reading Shakespeare's plays, when I first began reading Shakespeare, the history plays were plays that they felt inaccessible to me. Mm-hmm. I didn't find them approachable. Like I sort of understood what I was getting into when I was going to read a comedy, or I kind of understood, okay, a tragedy, I know what that's going to be. And a history play, I was like, this is going to be like going to school, or this is going to be like something I don't know anything about. And so it took me a while, I think, as a reader to get over that bias and actually come to enjoy the history plays. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what is this genre of history play, and what might people expect? What are some of the defining features of that genre?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, that sense of being turned off. Because there's so many characters, you don't know who they are. There's so many references to historical battles. You can't keep track, whose grandfather was whose and uncles, and so there's an enormous amount that can feel distancing. And one thing to keep in mind is that that wasn't the problem that Shakespeare's audience had. I mean, they knew these people the same way we know who, George Washington is and Abraham Lincoln. I mean, they knew who these people were. They had ideas about what their characters were like. They actually probably had read or heard quite a lot about them. The Elizabethans loved history. It was actually there was a kind of explosion of new history making that was done in the period. A number of important people. Raphael Holinshed is the historian that Shakespeare probably used the most, and he went back and took a lot of detail from Holinshed's histories, and there was sort of a sort of emergence of what we might call like modern standards of history in the period. That is to say, people writing history with the sort of high standards for trying to determine the truth that we expect out of historians. That was kind of a new invention of the Elizabethan era. If you look at historians before then, and including some of the ones Shakespeare used, they were a little more like literature. They would give you long speeches that some historical figure would give. Well, obviously that historian wasn't there and that didn't know what the speech was. They invented those speeches. They would include a lot of mythology, a lot of moral lessons. So reading history was almost a little bit more like other forms of literature. And so that actually might help too to keep in mind. So the history plays were hugely popular. People flocked to the theaters to go to the history plays. So unlike, I think, a lot of our modern experience where it feels a little distancing, they love this stuff. I think one of the reasons might just be the sword fights. I mean, there were just a lot of sword fights and battles and big heroic speeches, and people would go, and it would be stirring and exciting and awesome to watch people fighting.
Sure.
The same
Technical.
Yeah. And the same reason why we love, Westerns and war movies and thrillers and all of these things. It has many of the same kind of action elements that hack our theaters today.
How would Shakespeare's audiences have gotten their history that they would know to come into this? I mean, obviously, if Holinshed was writing books of history, right, that would have been published and people could purchase them. But if there's a stratification of Shakespeare's audience where some of them maybe educated, literate, could purchase a book, and some of them maybe not. So is this something that they would have gotten from plays or from other sort of oral sources? Or
that's a great question. I'm not really sure actually how best to answer that. I mean, you didn't have to read to get information from a book. Someone could read it to you.
Right.
Certainly the historians were read and popular. There are multiple editions of them. There were poems that delivered history, and there was, I think, just sort of the ongoing folk traditions. I mean, Henry V, the main character of Henry V, was himself a kind of legend in his youth, kind of like a Robin Hood-like legend for his dashing, ne'er-do-well attitudes. And so there was a great deal of kind of myth making too that went on, probably passed on orally. I mean, an interesting thing about it is that there weren't history plays before Shakespeare. I mean,
that's very interesting.
He basically invented the genre. I mean, there's some debate whether it was him or Marlowe. Marlowe was Christopher Marlowe, the great poet playwright and poet that just preceded Shakespeare, and Shakespeare actually modeled a lot of his work on Marlowe. So there's basically a debate about whether Marlowe's Edward II was the first major history play, or whether Shakespeare's Henry VI's were. But in either case, this is the sort of moment it gets invented. And so this strange thing, a history play, you ask about the genre. It will, as I said, like have sword fights. It'll have kings. It'll have battles. It'll have heroic speeches. And a lot of that can actually be a lot of fun. But it's worth saying it also was a major vehicle for nationalism. A lot of patriotism, as you can see in Henry V when you get to the St. Crispin's Day speech, for example. This sort of sense of like purpose, and I mean the same stuff that you find in a war movie that is like, World War II movie where we're celebrating American troops for being fabulous. You can get some of that same stuff going on in the history plays, but just as much you can get real political critique. So if what you're doing is telling stories about how this king usurped that king, there's an enormous space for the play to pull you to one side or the other, for you to feel that this is a meditation upon the politics of a monarchy, upon whether a king is a good king and what makes a good king, upon war and how that reflects upon a society. And all of those were very much part of what Shakespeare was doing in his history plays.
Well, which of Shakespeare's plays are sort of considered his history plays? And like, did he write them in order? Did he write them all at different times? Would you give us maybe an introduction to what those plays would be?
He made sure to confuse us. So there are probably 10 plays that people would list as his history plays. So that's almost a third of the folio. And most famous among them is the set of plays that lead to Henry V. So he wrote two major tetralogies. A tetralogy is a trilogy, but with four. So Henry V is the last of a series of four plays. So it goes from Richard II to Henry, which, by the way, the Globe did just about 3 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah.
I remember it, yeah. A really nice production. So it goes from Richard II to Henry IV Part 1 to Henry IV Part 2 to Henry V. And that's one tetralogy. The other tetralogy is the Henry VI series of plays, and there's 3 of them. And then the fourth play is Richard III, which probably a lot of people know, Hunchback Richard. So he has got 2 tetralogies, and what he did that's so confusing is that he wrote the tetralogy of Henry VI and Richard III. He wrote that first. That was actually he made his name in the early 1590s, first as a playwright of history plays, the Henry VI plays, which were hugely popular, and that's sort of where people first heard of Shakespeare. But the thing that's confusing is that those plays he wrote first, but they're actually come second in the order of events. So of course Henry VI comes after Henry V in real history. So Henry VI's are set in around like 1450s to about late 1400s, 1480s. So the second half of the 15th century.
And
But
can you remind us how long before his contemporary audience is this? It's 100 years ago? It's 200 years ago?
yeah, so he's writing in 1590, early 1590s for the first tetralogy. So 1590, and he's going back about 140 years,
Okay.
and then bringing you up to about 100 years ago. That's what the first tetralogy. I told you you're going to get confused.
Wow, that's a swath.
Yeah, and then the second tetralogy, the one that we're concerned with Henry V, that takes you further back in time. So that takes you to sort of the beginning of the 1400s through when was through I would say about like I'm trying to remember when Agincourt is. It's like about 1415. So yeah, so 1400 about 1420 is about the period of that set of plays. He writes those in 1595 through 99. So that's going back 180 years or so. It's kind of like, so when you look at Henry V, it'd be sort of like going to a movie now about the Civil War in America.
Okay.
Like everyone knows who won.
Yeah.
People know who the generals were. I mean, people know more or less about it, but you've heard of Ulysses Grant or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably actually have some pretty strong ideas about it.
Sure.
Like
why the war was fought and who was on the right side and all of that stuff. Yeah.
And if you went and saw a movie of the Civil War, I bet you would be watching. How are they going to handle slavery? How are they going to handle, these Robert E. Lee? Is he a hero or is he a villain? I mean, like these are questions you would ask today. And in the same way, these plays are doing politics that matter not just to then, but matter to Shakespeare's day.
Yeah. Yeah. Like any movie about the Civil War or play about the Civil War does today.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's our collective history and we know it and we're watching it performed and we're getting caught up in the emotion of it. So think of how much room there is to sway people's views about any number of political issues.
So what is the swath of history that's covered in the tetralogy that we're dealing with, from Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, Henry V?
Yeah.
What is that sort of, is there anything that, I mean, obviously that is a tremendous swath of history that we cannot cover in 15 minutes, but is there anything you can give us in broad strokes to sort of help us ground us in where we are and what some of those issues are that people might have been watching for when they saw this play?
Absolutely. I mean, I think probably most importantly would just be to take stock of Henry V himself, or as I want to call him, Hal, because that's his name in Henry IV Part 1. Henry V is this sort of grand performance of this great king. Henry V is one of the great kings of England, and he reigned for a long time, and he won all these battles, and everyone thought he was amazing, so he's a great king. But if you go back earlier in the tetralogy, you find him hanging out in the tavern with Falstaff, getting drunk and upsetting his father because he doesn't seem to take anything seriously at all. And that's part of the whole myth, is that he had this ne'er-do-well childhood, youthfulness in which he drank too much and wouldn't do what his father said. So you can go back to Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2 to find that. And I bet you a lot of people in our group know Falstaff and Hal. It's wonderful theater, very funny, very wild. And so the stories of the Henry IVs, Part 1 and 2, are the story of Hal being this sort of wastrel youth who then has to grow up, has to take on the responsibility of fighting the rebels against his own father's throne. And then by the end of Henry IV Part 2, he becomes king, and he has to dismiss Falstaff, dismiss all the tavern life that he led, and sort of take on the mantle of being king. And so Henry V starts, there's references to that, how, now he's this great king. So that's sort of part of the trajectory. And you can feel as you read Henry V, the ways in which he's left behind that life. But I think the important question is how much that life may have actually been part of what made him a great king. So then the other big thing I would point out in that trajectory is that there's a significant question of legitimacy for the kingship. And here you need to go back one step further in the tetralogy to Richard II, the first of the play of the tetralogies, because there, Hal's father, Henry IV, takes away the throne from Richard II. It's a usurpation.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard II was a pretty bad king in various ways, so, maybe he deserved it, but essentially there's no way to justify taking away a throne from a king. And then after you've done that, how do you turn around and say, oh, don't take my throne away?
Sure,
once you usurp one throne, you're at risk of usurpation yourself. So Hal's father, Henry IV, had a huge legitimacy problem, both in real history and in the plays. And somehow the journey of Hal from being this guy hanging out in the tavern to the king who wins the battle at Agincourt in Henry V, the great battle he wins against the French in the play you're about to read. Somehow in that journey there's also not just a journey of him growing up, there's a journey of legitimacy, of him establishing himself as one of the great kings when his father couldn't. So what is it that Hal does? How is it Hal gets there? What makes a king legitimate in the eyes of his people?
Mm-hmm. And would you say that this play ends with him fully established as a legitimate king, or are we setting up a future of continued struggle?
Both. The play absolutely shows him as a legitimate king. Not that there isn't plenty of room for interesting critique, because there is. But it's a play that without question, showcases the greatness of this king. But as it actually ends in an epilogue, it makes reference to the fact that the next stuff that's going to happen in history is hardly heroic, because Henry V, the successor, his son, Henry VI, was the weak king who set off all the internecine fighting that created the War of the Roses, that created all the violence that followed all in the first tetralogy. So it kind of does circle back. So everything fell apart after Henry V.
Yeah.
Historically.
Sorry, go ahead. When we're talking about reasons to retell a particular historical story in a given moment, because it does something for us in the moment when we're telling it, are there themes or aspects of that history that Shakespeare was interested in telling at his time in terms of making a political statement or doing a critique or anything like that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing to know about the history plays is they tell you as much about Shakespeare's history as they do about the history of the period it's reporting. Because, just like today, I mean, I bet you could look at movies of the Civil War and spot what decade they were made in, right? Mm-hmm. Based upon the politics. There's Gone with the Wind, now there's, so it tells you as much about Shakespeare's moment. One thing that, Henry V is often read as a real sort of nationalistic play, one that celebrates the warriors of England and their great victories. And, it was written right around the time that Elizabeth was sending the Earl of Essex up to Ireland to subdue the Irish. And they were mustering for a big war. So some people speculate that some of the kind of warlike jingoism of the play was a response to that moment. Just as surely, I feel like you can find critiques of such militarism in Henry V, even more so in Henry IV, Part 1, which I think is a deeply pacifist play. So you could see him kind of working out how it is we feel about that kind of nationalism, that kind of violence. And then the other place I think is so interesting in Henry IV's, but also present in Henry V, is Shakespeare's really trying to write a history play that includes the lower classes. So often history is told as a story of this king, this battle, then this king, then this battle. Well, but now if you look at how historians work today, you'll find histories of the working class, you'll find histories of women, you'll find histories of any number, people realize, well, if you're going to tell the history of a moment, you don't just talk about the kings and the battles, talk about what's going on in the rest of society, right? I mean, this is something that seems obvious to us today, but hasn't always been for historians obvious at all. But it was precisely Shakespeare's effort, I believe, in this tetralogy that we're talking about, to include the common foot soldiers, the working class, to bring you to places like taverns where you could see how kind of regular people worked, and for Hal or Henry V to actually try to interact with these people. For us to remember they're part of the history too. And of course they were part of Shakespeare's theater. I mean, there were wealthy people going to the theater, but there were also very working class people going to his theater, and he was speaking to all of them with his plays, including his history plays, which are meant to be ruminations upon politics and history that matter to everybody in society, not just the wealthy class.
And do we have some records, I know, but about how popular given plays were? And I know you mentioned Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3 being big hits in their time. Do we have a sense of Henry V and its popularity at the time? Obviously, it's become one of the more enduring, I would say, of the history plays.
Oh yeah, it was also very popular. There's some, it's always a sort of a patchwork thing to try to figure out how much it was performed, but there is evidence that it was performed many times. There is a quarto that came out in, I don't remember the quarto, 1600, I think. And that's evidence that it was, from the title page, you can see from the advertising that it was popular, and so someone was trying to sell the quarto in order to. So Henry V was popular, and it still is popular. It's one of those plays that gets performed a lot. People love it. It's kind of invigorating. It's really wonderful on stage. Like I said, for the battles, for the speeches, for the sort of sense of momentum, the kind of epic scope of it.
I mean, one of the things, just as a reader of these plays, I mean, I find like Henry VI, 1, 2, and 3 much harder to read than plays like Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. And to me, I think a lot of that is character. That I feel like you have this really strong central character in Henry IV, 1 and 2, and in Henry V that we're following, this Hal, that we have a nickname for him. We're just calling him by his nickname now. He's not just Edward III. He's Hal. He's our friend. Yeah. And I don't know if that's particular to these stories, and I don't know if that represents a development in Shakespeare's storytelling, or if it's just that this particular figure was such a compelling historical figure in a way, say Richard II wasn't, as a different kind of person. It was just a more natural theatrical character, or if it represents a sort of a character development in Shakespeare's own writing.
Oh, I think it does show his development of his art. I mean, Henry VI's, as I said, were his first hits. I mean, they were early plays, and character is just one of probably a long list of things we could make about what makes those plays way less great than Henry IV's and V. I mean, they're early plays.
I was edging toward harder to read, but
yeah, I mean, so the plots are confusing, and they sort of have this wild sense. I mean, there's really interesting stuff in it. But yeah, there's no question his art is developing. You can even feel it. Richard III, which is a great play and people love it. You can feel how its structure is really kind of all over the place. It's just shaky and has lots, and I can't think of a Shakespeare play that's more brilliantly plotted than Henry IV Part 1. I mean, it's absolutely stunning in the intricacy of its structure and plot, as well as its great characters, Hal, but also Hotspur, also Falstaff. And Henry V is really interestingly structured, quite unusual, actually. It has a chorus in front of every single one of its acts. Like Romeo and Juliet has a chorus in the beginning of Act 1 and beginning of Act 2, and then no more chorus. It just disappears inexplicably. I think this is the only Shakespeare play that does this, that gives you 5 choruses and an epilogue. So this chorus keeps coming back like a narrator, and it serves that way. It just fills you in with all kinds of information. So structurally, it's so much easier. I mean, it's so you don't get lost at all, because the chorus is just there to show up like every half hour to be like, okay, the next thing that happens, right?
Watch for this.
Yeah, precisely. But that structure is part of what he's doing too, because there's no question that the chorus, plays a role in creating this, I think, kind of heroic king and this kind of heroic sense of, kind of epic sense of battle. And then what happens, I think, is that you hear the chorus and then the action starts, and it doesn't always match what you're expecting from the chorus. That is to say, there's plenty of room for critique of that kind of heroism. And that critique comes in how the play unfolds and what the characters are saying to each other and what emotions are aroused in your reading.
Interesting. As we sort of come to the end, I just want to remind folks watching, please, I'm on the lookout for your questions. I'm ready to stick them into the chat and address them. But I want to ask you, as we're waiting to see if anybody is curious about any aspect of history plays, I'd love to know again, and this is a question I think I asked you when we were doing Taming of the Shrew, if you had pointers for us on reading Henry V. I mean, we're sort of coming from a comedy into this sort of history play. And do you have any suggestions for us as we're reading our way through to help us have the most positive reading experience?
Yeah. Keep turning back to the dramatis persona, the list of characters at the beginning. Just keep checking. Don't be shy to use your footnotes. There will be confusing moments. But I guess I would say, coming from Taming, that some of the stuff I've been saying about war movies or action movies, I would take that to heart and recognize that an enormous amount of what's exciting about this play is that sort of sense of epic speeches and heroic speeches and that kind of amazing sort of sense of collective effort and nationalism, which can be a very frightening thing too, and one can keep one's eyes open for where we get frightened. I mean, at one point, the king, Hal, orders the killing of all the soldiers he's taken hostage. So, I mean, and so there have been trials, people have asked, is he a war criminal? So, I mean, there's a lot of room there to ruminate on those things, but at the same time to feel, I don't know, I guess, in Henry V, in some ways, I think you might see the kind of origins of all the war movies we've ever seen. The kind of the tropes and cliches that we know from those movies, you'll see them, you'll see some of them. And so you can read and feel that sort of sense and recognize that you're kind of looking at Shakespeare kind of developing this format and these ideas that we actually know pretty well today. So that, I think that might help. One other thing, I guess, it has a kind of weird beginning because there's this argument about the Salic law. Which is this argument that these bishops are having about basically whether Hal has a claim to the throne of France.
Okay, well, that said, I'm going to come put this little question here.
Okay, good.
Well, question being, what do you think of the opening scene with its possibly cynical motives for getting Henry to invade France? This is from Stephen Jensen.
Oh, well, I actually would be curious to know what this person thinks the cynical motives might be.
Oh, okay. Yes, please.
They're clearly they're doing. So we can hear from this person maybe. What are the cynical motives in your reading? Because what the scene is like these bishops are coming up with these arguments as to why Hal actually does have a claim in France, and they're not particularly good arguments. So you sit there and you go, okay, what they're doing is basically stirring up a claim for a war, which is, essentially what he's going to go do is go invade France and end up winning in Agincourt and staking a claim at by the end of the play he becomes heir to the throne, so staking a claim for England to basically claim the French throne, which doesn't end up lasting.
I'm going to take this. Oh, here we go.
The bishops want to distract Henry from taxing church. Yes, they do have those motives. That is part of it, absolutely.
Quick, look over there.
Yeah. I mean, there's, there are these deep dives that you can do at any of these moments, and a lot of them are echoed in the text as well. So one can start to kind of feel how, just as we know today, any political motive has what they say they're going to do, and then what is really driving it, right?
I have another question here. I'm going to pull over. This is a question about this chorus and its actual, how it appears on stage. How many actors read the chorus, and is it speech or song? I guess my first question is that something that's indicated in the text? Is that something that we know at all from the history, how the chorus would have been represented, and how is it most commonly done today if it's included in the in production today?
I mean, it's often just one person, but I think that's a production choice. It's not a song; it's poetry. So it's in meter, it's in blank verse, as Shakespeare usually writes in, and has a sort of sense of musicality to it. But chorus, not in the sense of singing, but chorus in the sense, as you find in, say, the Greek plays, which actually have their origins in chanting, but essentially this possibility of being multiple people is part of it too. So I've seen it both ways. I don't know, Daniel, have you seen, what do you have an idea about modern practice?
No, I really don't. I'm not sure. It feels like something that it did not make a strong impression in previous productions I've seen. I'm not like, oh, that was an interesting choral choice. I feel like it's often a person who comes out and recites this thing and then sort of comes off stage. But I don't know if we know how it would have been originally interpreted.
Yeah, I don't know that one. I don't know like original practices, how they did the chorus, but I mean, I've seen it both ways, which obviously becomes a production choice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not specifically, I think, in the text.
Question also then becomes like, if you're grounding that chorus in a realistic part of the world, like, do you have random people on the street who are delivering pieces of a chorus, or do you have some godlike, all-knowing figure who is telling a chorus from that? I think there's a lot of production drive to be made in whether you're including that and how you are embodying that in terms of what that person looks like, or what those people's function is in the world of the play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm actually looking down, quickly leafing through the play to see if there's any obvious marker of it. But I mean, I think I'm right in saying that each speech of the chorus, essentially is given to one voice. So it's very, and often I think done as one person, but there's no reason why it couldn't be more.
The last sort of, as you were talking, I was recalling a helpful tip from my graduate studies of reading both Shakespeare history plays and Chekhov plays. When you mentioned referring back to the dramatis personae, and I can recall often printing that out as like a bookmark and like having it in my book, so that when I would come to a new person, I didn't have to flip the page back. I could just be like, it's that person. Okay, good. Yeah. So I'll see if I can find some of those old bookmarks. I'll see if I can stick one in the group if anyone is reading in a hard copy and wants to print your people out on a bookmark, so you don't have to flip back to see who the heck is that person again. Well, I think that's our sort of the end of our time. I want to thank you so much, Abe, for coming back and talking to us again. I look forward to diving into the play with the group. We're going to continue our conversation on Friday, this coming Friday at noon. Ray Chambers is going to come talk to us. He's another faculty in our USD Old Globe Shiley graduate acting program. And we're going to talk a little bit about acting and directing this piece. Ray's the best. Yeah. All right. So I look forward to seeing you all here again on Friday. And thank you so much again, Abe, for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Enjoy, everybody. Enjoy.
Have fun.